So this is a story that I heard a long time ago in the oral tradition from another storyteller. I have no idea where it comes from. And I don't remember who the storyteller was, but there's a tradition amongst storytellers all over the world that whenever you tell a story, the spirit of everyone that told that story before you, alive or dead, stands behind the storyteller, listening to the story. So I want you to imagine all those spirits of storytellers that have gone before me standing at my shoulder when I tell this story. And this is a story about a little girl called Bilongitta. And when I say she was a little girl, I mean she was a really little girl. She was such a little girl that her mother couldn't buy clothes to fit her. Even dolls' clothes, even Barbie clothes wouldn't fit her. And so Bilongitta's mother had to make all her clothes herself. And she wasn't very good at sewing. And so poor Bilongitta, her clothes were never quite right. There was always something wrong with them. Sometimes her mother would absent-mindedly sew her dresses with 3 sleeves in them. Other times she might sew up the skirt so that Bilongitta couldn't get her legs in. There was always something not quite right, and poor Bilongitta always looked a little bit peculiar. And as well as not making the clothes very well, her mother was always daydreaming, and she very often carelessly left needles and pins sticking in Bilongitta's clothes. And on this particular day, Bilongitta's mother wanted to go shopping. And she called Bilongitta to her and she said, "Bilongitta, today I need to go to the shops, but I don't want to take you with me. I'm in rather a hurry, and the last time I took you shopping with me, I lost you down the back seat of the bus, I lost you under the deep freeze in the supermarket, and then I lost you again at the checkout. I haven't got time for any of that nonsense today, Bilongitta. So I want you to stay at home, be a good girl, I won't be very long, and whatever you do, I don't want you to go into the field at the back of the house, because if you do, I'll lose you as sure as eggs are eggs. So stay inside like a good girl until I come home." And Bilongitta said she would. So Bilongitta's mother, she put on her high-heeled shoes, she did her mascara, she put on her lipstick, she got her market basket and a bus pass. She set off out of the front door, locking it behind her, and sailed off to do her shopping. But as soon as she was gone, do you think that girl stayed in the house? She didn't. She didn't go out the back door, though. She was too little for that. She couldn't reach the handle. Instead, she snuck out through the cat flap. And she made her way into the field at the back of the house. And it was beautiful. It was a lovely sunny day. The grasses were high above her head. She was so tiny that the grasses were like a jungle to her. And the daisies were like lampposts. And she could play with the insects. She rode on a ladybird for a little while. She got a blade of grass and teased a worm with it because she knew that they're harmless. And all the time, she was going further and further out into the field. She had no thought of time. She was having a wonderful day. She just kept on going. She'd walked really quite a long way for such a very small person, when she noticed a change in the weather. The sky had been blue without a cloud in it, but now there were great black clouds above her head, and she gave a little shiver. And then drops of rain began to fall. And to us, we would have just got a little bit wet, but to Bilongitta, every drop of rain was like someone emptying a whole paddling pool full of water over her head. And she thought, "Oh no, what am I going to do? I'll drown if I stay out here. I've got to find some shelter. It's too far to get back home again. Where can I go?" And she looked around, and then she began to notice for the first time that the field was full of mushrooms. Nice white field mushrooms that are good to eat. But to Bilongitta, they were like the size of an outside umbrella. So she ran up to the nearest mushroom and she wrapped her arms around the stalk, and she was perfectly dry. The rain splashed down around the big mushroom, and she was as dry as anything underneath, just like an umbrella. And she stood there holding onto the stalk of the mushroom and laughing at the raindrops. But then the ground beneath the mushroom began to rumble and shake, and Bilongitta, holding onto it, found herself sailing through the air and being thrown into a basket full of other mushrooms. Because in the field there was an old lady, and the old lady was picking mushrooms to make into a soup. And she just happened to pick the mushroom that Bilongitta was holding on to. And poor Bilongitta, she tried to stand up in the basket, and she called, "Don't pick me! I'm not a mushroom, I'm Bilongitta." But the old lady didn't hear her. She was rather deaf, Bilongitta was very little, and she wasn't expecting to find a tiny little girl in amongst the mushrooms. So she just didn't notice. She went on picking mushrooms, and as fast as Bilongitta would struggle to her feet, another mushroom would knock her back into the basket again. until at last the old lady had enough mushrooms, and Bilongitta felt the basket being lifted up, and she could feel the old lady walking across the field, and then she heard the sound of a latch being lifted as she reached her cottage. The basket was dumped on the table, and Bilongitta heard the sound of taps being turned on, and the next thing, Bilongitta found herself hurled into a sink full of icy cold water, and she was being swished around with the mushrooms to wash them. And she blew water from her mouth, and she said, "Don't wash me! I'm not a mushroom, I'm Bilongitta." But still the old lady didn't hear her. The old lady gathered everything up, all the mushrooms, and she put them into a colander with Bilongitta amongst them, gave it a good shake, and then she emptied them all out onto a chopping board. She had a great big knife and she was chopping mushrooms. And poor Bilongitta, she was rolling from side to side to escape from the blade, shouting, "Don't chop me! I'm not a mushroom, I'm Bilongitta." But still the old lady didn't hear her. And she gathered everything up and some onions that she chopped that made Bilongitta's eyes water. She dumped the whole lot into a saucepan. She poured in some olive oil and she turned on the gas. And then she shook in herbs and black pepper. Poor Bilongitta, achoo! Achoo! And then she poured in boiling water. Now, fortunately for Bilongitta, one of the mushrooms hadn't got chopped, and she was able to just sit in it like a boat. And she was sailing around in the bubbling water, shouting, "Don't cook me! I'm not a mushroom! I'm Bilongitta!" Still the old lady didn't hear her. And at last, when the soup was ready, the old lady got a ladle. She ladled up a big ladle full of soup, and Bilongitta was on that ladle, and she was emptied into the old lady's bowl. And the old lady took a spoon, and by now poor Bilongitta had given up shouting. The old lady just couldn't hear her. There was no point. She put a spoon into the soup, and Bilongitta was on that spoon. And the old lady opened her mouth and began to shovel Bilongitta into it. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked at the back of your throat in front of a mirror. Maybe if you've had a wobbly tooth or a bit of a sore throat. And if you have, you may have noticed at the back of your throat there's a little thing that dangles down in the middle. It's called your uvula. Not many people know that. And Bilongitta, as she was shovelled into the old lady's mouth, she was just about to slide down her throat when she noticed the uvula, and she grabbed it with both hands, and there she was, dangling at the back of the old lady's throat. Well, it made the old lady cough. She coughed so hard, she coughed Bilongitta and the soup right out of her mouth. And such was the force and velocity of her cough that Bilongitta went shooting across the kitchen, just like a cannonball out of a cannon, straight out of the window and splat on the grass outside. It knocked all the breath out of her body. She was lying there, all covered in bits of mushroom soup, pepper, old lady spit. It was revolting. And she lay there thinking, nothing in my whole life can ever be worse than this. But just then it was, because in the field there was a donkey. And that donkey was happily minding its own business, chomping the grass. And it just happened to chomp up the tuft of grass that poor Bilongitta was lying on. It happened so fast that Bilongitta was swept down into the donkey's stomach. She didn't even have time to look and see if it had a uvula. And the next thing, she found herself standing in the middle of the donkey's stomach, in the darkness, waist deep in donkey's stomach contents, chewed up grass, chewed up buttercups. It was horrible. And she stood there in the darkness and thought, how am I ever going to get out? And then she thought to herself, maybe if I was to try tickling the donkey from inside its stomach, I wonder if I could make it sick. And so she reached out with her little hands until she could feel the wall of the donkey's stomach, and she began to scrabble and tickle and scrape, and the donkey felt most peculiar. He stopped eating grass. He lifted up his head. He said, "Ee-aw, ee-aw, bleh," and he sicked up everything in his stomach, including Bilongitta. And she lay there on the grass, and now she was covered in donkey sick, buttercups, bits of grass, mushroom soup, black pepper, old lady spit. It was horrible. And she lay there thinking that nothing in her whole life would ever be worse than that. But just then it was. Because a big black bird was out looking for worms for its babies. And it saw lying on the ground a long, thin, slimy thing, and understandably it thought it was a worm. So it flew down, it picked up Bilongitta by the front of her pinafore, and before she could even squeak, it was flying through the air with her back to its nest, and it just dropped tucked her into the nest, in amongst its baby birds that were all just sitting there with their beaks open, ready for worms. And Bilongitta found her voice and she shouted, "Don't feed me to your babies! I'm not a worm, I'm Bilongitta." And the mother blackbird looked at her and said, "Oh my dear, so you are. You're that little girl that comes and feeds me on the bird table with her mother sometimes, but what were you doing down there all covered in? Can that be mushroom soup? And surely that's not donkey sick." And Bilongitta said, "Oh," she said, "my mother went shopping and she told me not to go and play in the field at the back of the house, and I did. And then I got picked by an old lady and she made me into mushroom soup, and then she swallowed me and then she coughed me up, and then a donkey ate me, and then he sicked me up, and now you're trying to feed me to your babies." And the mother bird said, "Oh, you poor little girl. What an awful day you're having. Let me try and clean you up a bit." And the blackbird pulled some grass with her beak from the side of the nest, and she began to brush down Bilongitta. She wiped off all the donkey sick and the buttercups, most of the mushroom soup. She dried her hair, and then she tucked her up in amongst the baby birds. And she said, "Now you rest there, and I'll go and get you something nice to eat. Are you hungry?" And Bilongitta said, "Yes, I haven't had anything since breakfast." But she said, "Could it please not be worms?" And the mother blackbird flew away. Well, Bilongitta, she snuggled down with the baby birds, and for the first time that morning, after all her really hard adventures, she began to feel quite comfortable and warm and drowsy, and she was snuggled amongst the little fluffy baby birds, and she was almost nodding off to sleep when a sound woke her up really fast. Bilongitta jumped to her feet. She went over to the edge of the nest and she looked over it, and to her horror, coming up the tree was a serpent, looking for eggs or baby birds to eat. Up and up it came. Bilongitta thought, "What can I do? I can't let that snake eat the mother blackbird's babies, and it might eat me too. I need a weapon." Now cast your minds back to the beginning of the story, when I said that Bilongitta's mother was really bad at sewing, and she was always leaving pins and needles stuck in her skirt or a dress. It so happened that Bilongitta was wearing a new frock that morning, and stuck right through the middle of the apron was a big darning needle. And Bilongitta, quick as a flash, she whipped out that darning needle, she leapt onto the edge of the nest, she pointed it right in the snake's face, and she said, "On guard." Well, the snake got a big shock. It wasn't expecting to find a baby bird wearing clothes and brandishing a sword, and it began to feel that perhaps it had picked the wrong nest. So it turned around and it made its way back down again, just as the mother bird came back and saw everything. And she said, "Oh, Bilongitta, you've saved my babies. How can I ever thank you?" But by now, poor Bilongitta, she really had enough. And she lifted up her voice and she said, "I want to go home. I want my mum. I don't like it here." And the mother blackbird said, "And so you shall." And she picked up Bilongitta by the back of her pinafore, and she flew with her through the air, but she didn't take her back home again. No. Instead, she put her down very gently on the grass at the bottom of the tree, and then the mother blackbird, she put her beak under her wing and she pulled out a little tiny bone. Now, to us, it would have been a very small bone indeed, but to Bilongitta, being so tiny, that bone was the size of a small log. And the mother blackbird, she laid it down on the grass in front of Bilongitta, and she said, "Now, Bilongitta, I want you to roll that bone all the way home. And if you do, something truly wonderful will happen." And Bilongitta had no idea what she meant, but she thanked the mother blackbird, and the mother blackbird flew back to her babies, and Bilongitta began to roll the bone. And at first it was very hard, it was very heavy for her. But as she rolled it with each turn of the bone, she began to notice that something was happening to her. She felt like she was being pulled and tugged and stretched, and she began to realise that with every turn of the bone, she was growing bigger and taller and wider. She grew and she grew, and she carried on rolling the bone until at last she got right back to her very own back door. And when she got back to her very own back door, she found that she wasn't a little tiny girl anymore. She was a proper sized person. And that's the story of Bilongitta.